Welcome to Warfield Chronicles. The Department of Justice just declared mission accomplished on the Epstein files, but what they're hiding might be even bigger than what they released. Here's what happened. 2 days ago, federal prosecutors stood before judges and said they needed more time. They weren't finished. The Epstein document production was ongoing. Fast forward 48 hours, and suddenly Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche is at a podium announcing they're completely done. 3 million pages released, case closed. Move along, nothing more to see here. But here's the problem. When the DOJ says they released 3 million pages, that sounds massive, right? But dig into the numbers and you discover they initially collected 6 million pages. Half the evidence vanished without explanation. Nobody at the Department of Justice will tell us where those missing 3 million pages went or why they were excluded from public release. And that's just the beginning of this rabbit hole. Lisa Phillips is one of the most prominent voices in the Epstein survivor community. She's been fighting alongside 1,200 other survivors demanding transparency and accountability. When she started reviewing the released documents, she immediately noticed something disturbing. Files would appear on the government website with Donald Trump's name prominently featured, then mysteriously disappear within hours. This kept happening. Upload, download, upload, download. Every single time a tip sheet mentioned Trump in connection with Epstein parties or Mar-a-Lago incidents, it would vanish from public access. Let me share one specific example that was briefly visible before being scrubbed. An online complainant filed a detailed report with the FBI, not local police, but the actual Federal Bureau of Investigation. She described witnessing a sex trafficking operation at Trump's golf resort in Rancho Palos Verdes, California, between 1995 and 1996. The report named Ghislaine Maxwell as the coordinator and facilitator of sex parties. The client list allegedly included Jeffrey Epstein, television personality Robin Leach, and Donald Trump himself. But the truly chilling part comes next. This complainant reported participating in organized gatherings and stated that multiple young women disappeared during this period. The rumor among participants was that these missing women had been murdered and their bodies buried on the property. When victims risk everything to speak truth, we owe them investigation, not silence. The complainant further stated she received direct threats from Trump's head of security at that time. She was told if she ever spoke about what occurred at that location or what she witnessed, she would end up fertilizing the back 9 holes like the others. Using language that Trump himself has been documented using in other contexts. Now, a reasonable person might ask why we should believe anonymous tips. That's a fair question. But here's what makes these FBI reports significant. These weren't random phone calls to a tip line. These were formal submissions to federal investigators by individuals identifying themselves as underage victims. The FBI took detailed notes. They assigned case numbers. They documented these allegations over a period exceeding 10 years. Lisa Phillips points out something crucial. You don't file false reports with the FBI as a joke. The consequences for lying to federal agents are severe. These complainants put themselves at legal and personal risk to come forward. So when Todd Blanche holds his press conference and a journalist asks him to speak directly to survivors who've expressed frustration with the entire process, how does he respond? Let me walk you through his actual answer because it reveals everything wrong with the Department of Justice's approach. The reporter gives Blanche a softball opportunity. She essentially says, "Here's your moment to show empathy and speak to victims who've suffered for decades. What would you like to say to them?" Blanche's immediate response, "Well, I share their frustration." Think about that for a second. The Deputy Attorney General of the United States, representing the institution responsible for investigating these crimes, equates his professional frustration with the lifetime trauma of sex trafficking survivors. As if processing paperwork in an office is equivalent to being abused as a child and then waiting 30 years for accountability. Bureaucratic inconvenience is not the same as lifelong trauma. Lisa Phillips watched that press conference in real time. Her reaction was visceral. She described feeling like Blanche fundamentally doesn't comprehend what survivors have endured. He's going through the motions of expressing concern, but his first instinct was to center himself and the Department of Justice as victims of this process too. Only after realizing how callous that sounded did Blanche add a perfunctory comment about survivors experiencing unspeakable pain. But that wasn't his genuine first reaction. His actual impulse was to complain about his own department's burden. Then Blanche says something even more troubling. He questions why everyone suddenly started talking about Epstein last spring and summer, as if it's some inexplicable trend, as if 1,200 survivors haven't been screaming for justice for decades, as if this wasn't a coordinated sex trafficking network involving powerful people across multiple countries. Lisa explains that survivors mobilize specifically because they know this case extends far beyond one man. Jeffrey Epstein didn't operate alone. He had enablers, facilitators, clients, and conspirators. The evidence exists in massive quantities. Yet Blanche stands at that podium and claims there's no indication anyone else was involved. How can you release 3 million pages of documents containing dozens of FBI reports from victims naming specific powerful individuals and then claim with a straight face that there's no evidence of additional perpetrators? The cognitive dissonance is staggering. These weren't vague accusations. Survivors called the FBI and provided names, dates, locations, and detailed descriptions of what they witnessed and experienced. Federal agents documented everything for years, across multiple administrations. And now the current administration wants us to believe that after reviewing all that documentation, they found nothing actionable beyond Epstein himself, who conveniently died in federal custody before facing full accountability. Let's talk about the timing of this final document dump. The Department of Justice chose to release these files during a week when immigration enforcement dominated every news cycle. Survivors who had been scheduled to appear on major news networks received last-minute cancellations. Producers apologized, but explained that breaking news about ICE operations took priority. Lisa Phillips and other survivors were supposed to have their moment on national television to discuss these revelations. Instead, they were bumped indefinitely because the news cycle shifted, almost as if someone calculated the perfect moment to bury this story under other headlines. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe it's exactly what it looks like, a strategic move to minimize public attention on deeply incriminating evidence. Here's another troubling detail. The files that briefly appeared before being removed didn't just mention Trump in passing. They described specific allegations of criminal activity at properties he owned and controlled. They named him as a participant in events where underage victims were present. Every time documentation like this surfaced, it disappeared. Not once, not twice, multiple times following the exact same pattern: upload, brief visibility, removal from public access. Lisa Phillips lives near the Rancho Palos Verdes golf course mentioned in one of those FBI reports. She goes hiking there to find peace and process her own trauma. Now she has to reconcile the knowledge that, according to witness testimony, young women may have been murdered and buried on that very property. She describes the experience as re-traumatizing. Every revelation forces survivors to relive their pain while watching the institutions supposedly designed to protect them fail repeatedly. The Department of Justice treats this like a bureaucratic checkbox exercise: release documents, hold press conference, move on to next agenda item. But for survivors, each new piece of evidence represents a real person who suffered real harm. Each redaction or missing file could contain the key to holding someone powerful accountable. Each dismissive comment from officials compounds decades of institutional betrayal. Todd Blanche's press conference embodied this disconnect perfectly. When given a direct opportunity to acknowledge survivor pain and demonstrate genuine commitment to justice, he chose instead to minimize, deflect, and ultimately declare the matter closed. The Transparency Act that mandated these releases passed because survivors and their advocates fought relentlessly. They organized, testified before Congress, and refused to let this issue disappear. Politicians from both parties publicly committed to full disclosure. Then the actual implementation happened, and suddenly we're getting incomplete releases, missing files, strategic timing, and dismissive press conferences. The gap between promised transparency and delivered transparency is enormous. Lisa Phillips makes a crucial point about believing survivors. When someone reports sexual abuse or trafficking, the default response should be to investigate thoroughly, not to dismiss or ignore. When multiple people report similar experiences involving the same locations and individuals, that demands serious attention. Yet the pattern we're seeing suggests the opposite approach. Minimize, redact, release on busy news days. Declare mission accomplished before the investigation is genuinely complete. The FBI reports that briefly surfaced contained allegations of organized gatherings involving older men and underage girls. They described coercion, threats, disappearances, and potential murders. These reports came from multiple sources over many years. They weren't isolated incidents or single uncorroborated claims. How does that square with Todd Blanche's assertion that there's no evidence of a broader network? It doesn't, unless you're deliberately choosing not to see what's directly in front of you. Survivors aren't asking for special treatment or rushing to judgment without evidence. They're asking for the evidence that exists to be investigated with the same rigor that would be applied if the accused weren't wealthy and powerful. Imagine if these allegations involved an organized criminal network without political connections. Imagine if the missing women were connected to gang activity in an urban neighborhood. Would the Justice Department shrug and say, "We released the files, our job is done"? Absolutely not. There would be ongoing investigations, indictments, press conferences announcing arrests, and politicians congratulating law enforcement for dismantling a dangerous criminal enterprise. But when the allegations involve private jets, exclusive resorts, and people in positions of power, suddenly we get incomplete document dumps and declarations that nothing actionable exists. Lisa Phillips says survivors are prepared for the long fight ahead. This announcement from the Department of Justice isn't the end. It's another chapter in an ongoing battle for accountability. Lawsuits are coming. Survivors and their advocates will return to federal court challenging the completeness and adequacy of the DOJ's document production. They'll demand explanations for the missing 3 million pages. They'll question why files were uploaded and then removed. They'll push for genuine investigation, not just file releases. Congress will hold oversight hearings. Democratic members are already preparing questions for the next time Todd Blanche or other Justice Department officials appear before committees. The public record is being built. When officials testify under oath that they've completed their obligations and provided full transparency, they'll face pointed questions about specific omissions and inconsistencies. The pressure will continue mounting. Meanwhile, independent journalists, researchers, and advocates are combing through the 3 million pages that were released. They're finding connections, documenting patterns, and building comprehensive timelines. Just because the Justice Department declares something finished doesn't mean the investigation stops. Lisa discovered multiple FBI tip sheets during her initial review. Other advocates are finding similar documentation. The released files contain far more than the Department of Justice acknowledged in their press conference. Each new discovery gets shared across survivor networks and advocacy organizations. Information that was briefly visible before being scrubbed gets preserved and documented. Screenshots, archives, and backups ensure that even deleted files don't disappear completely. This is why the timing and manner of the release matters so much. By dumping millions of pages on a Friday during a major news cycle about immigration enforcement, the Justice Department made it harder for journalists and survivors to process everything systematically. But they underestimated the determination of people who've been fighting this battle for decades. Survivors aren't going to get distracted and move on. They're going to keep digging until every page is reviewed and every lead is pursued. The allegation about potential murders and burials at the Rancho Palos Verdes golf course represents the kind of claim that demands follow-up investigation. Was ground-penetrating radar deployed? Were cadaver dogs brought in? Did investigators interview former employees or security personnel? We don't know because the Department of Justice won't say. They released the tip sheet, shrugged and said they found nothing actionable. That's not how investigations of this magnitude should work. When someone reports witnessing organized criminal activity, including possible homicides, you investigate. You corroborate or disprove. You don't just file the report and move on. Lisa Phillips describes living with this knowledge as traumatic. The place where she seeks solace and healing is now associated with some of the darkest allegations in the entire Epstein case. She can't unhear what she learned from those FBI reports. And she represents just one survivor among 1,200 who are processing this information and dealing with the re-traumatization that comes from seeing institutions fail them repeatedly. The broader public might hear 3 million pages released and think that sounds comprehensive, but survivors and advocates who understand how document production works know that page count means nothing without completeness and context. What's in those missing 3 million pages? What's in the files that were uploaded then removed? What's been redacted under claims of national security or ongoing investigations? The Department of Justice owes specific answers to those questions, not vague statements about satisfying legal obligations. Todd Blanche's press conference revealed the administration's actual priority. Make this go away as quickly as possible. Don't pursue new leads. Don't expand investigations. Release what you must, claim victory, and close the book. But that approach only works if survivors, journalists, and the public accept it. And they're not accepting it. Social media erupted within hours of the press conference. Hashtags demanding full accountability trended across multiple platforms. Survivors shared their reactions to Blanche's comments. Advocates highlighted specific documents that raise serious questions. The conversation isn't ending because the Justice Department says it's over. If anything, declaring premature completion has energized opposition and skepticism. This is a critical moment for independent media and citizen journalism. Major news networks might move on to the next story, but independent content creators, podcasters, and researchers are just getting started. The Epstein case represents everything wrong with how powerful institutions protect powerful people. It's a test of whether accountability still exists when allegations involve the wealthy and connected. Survivors have made clear they won't stop fighting. Lisa Phillips and other advocates are organizing, coordinating, and planning their next moves. They're working with attorneys to file legal challenges. They're connecting with members of Congress willing to hold oversight hearings. They're also doing something equally important, keeping public attention focused on this story when authorities want it to disappear. Justice delayed is justice denied, but surrender is not an option. Every time someone shares information about the missing documents, they counter the official narrative. Every time someone questions Todd Blanche's dismissive comments, they make it harder to sweep this under the rug. The documents that were briefly visible before removal are particularly significant. Why would the Justice Department upload files to their official release site, only to remove them hours later? Technical glitch, possible but unlikely, especially when the pattern repeats multiple times with files containing similar content. More plausible explanation, someone realized certain documents were more damaging than anticipated and pulled them back. But the internet doesn't forget. Once something goes public, even briefly, people capture it. Screenshots circulate, archives preserve. The attempt to memory hole incriminating evidence creates more suspicion than if they'd just left it up. This is the Streisand effect in action. By trying to hide specific allegations, the Justice Department drew more attention to exactly what they wanted buried. Now researchers are specifically looking for patterns in what got removed versus what stayed public. They're analyzing which names, locations, and allegations triggered deletions. That analysis will produce its own revelations. Meanwhile, Lisa Phillips and other survivors are dealing with the emotional toll of all this. Watching your trauma become a political football is exhausting. Seeing officials minimize what you experienced is enraging, but they persist because they know what's at stake. If powerful people can traffic children and face no consequences, what message does that send? If institutions can bury evidence and declare cases closed prematurely, who's actually safe? This isn't about partisan politics or attacking specific individuals based on party affiliation. This is about fundamental accountability regardless of who's implicated. If evidence points to Democrats, investigate Democrats. If evidence points to Republicans, investigate Republicans. If evidence points to celebrities, business leaders, or royalty, investigate them too. The principle is simple. Children deserve protection, survivors deserve justice, and power shouldn't grant immunity from consequences. That's what survivors are demanding. That's what the public deserves. And that's what the Department of Justice appears unwilling to provide. So the fight continues. Legal challenges will be filed. Oversight hearings will be demanded. Independent investigations will proceed. Public pressure will mount. Todd Blanche's press conference was supposed to close this chapter. Instead, it opened a new one. By dismissing survivor concerns, declaring premature completion, and offering no explanation for missing evidence, he guaranteed continued scrutiny. The released documents raise more questions than they answer. Why did half the collected evidence not make it into the public release? Who made that decision? What criteria determined inclusion versus exclusion? What's in those missing 3 million pages that the public isn't allowed to see? Are they duplicates? Are they classified? Are they simply too damaging to certain powerful individuals? Without transparency about the exclusion process, every claim of completeness rings hollow. Survivors and advocates aren't obligated to simply trust the Justice Department's assertions when the same department has failed them repeatedly. Lisa Phillips represents a community that's been gaslit, minimized, and dismissed for decades. They were told Epstein was an isolated case. They were told it wasn't that widespread. They were told justice would come. Now they're being told the investigation is complete and nothing more can be done. After waiting 30 years, they're supposed to accept that explanation and move on. They're not moving on because they know what they experienced. They know what they witnessed. They know other survivors' stories. And they know the documentary evidence supports everything they've been saying. When FBI reports describe organized trafficking operations at specific locations involving named individuals, that's not conspiracy theory. That's documented allegations requiring investigation. When multiple complainants independently report similar experiences at the same properties during the same time periods, that's corroboration. When victims provide detailed accounts to federal investigators over many years, that's a pattern. The Justice Department can declare they found nothing actionable, but the released documents tell a different story. Unless actionable has been redefined to mean politically convenient to pursue. That's the cynical interpretation, and unfortunately, it fits the observed facts better than any innocent explanation. Survivors deserve better. Victims deserve better. The public deserves better. This story isn't over. The fight for accountability continues, and platforms like Warfield Chronicles will keep covering developments as they unfold. If you found this coverage valuable, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what questions you want answered about the Epstein files. We're going to keep digging and keep reporting what we find. Subscribe to Warfield Chronicles for ongoing coverage of stories the mainstream media might prefer to ignore. This is too important to let slide into obscurity. The next phase involves legal challenges to the document production, congressional oversight hearings, and continued independent investigation. We'll be covering all of it. Lisa Phillips will return to discuss new findings as more people analyze the released documents. Other survivors and advocates will share their perspectives. Attorneys involved in filing lawsuits will explain their legal strategies. This is a long-term story with massive implications. It's about whether accountability exists for the most powerful people in society. It's about whether institutions serve justice or protect the elite. The answer to those questions will emerge from what happens next. Do survivors get brushed aside again, or does real investigation finally occur? Does Congress exercise meaningful oversight, or do they hold performative hearings that change nothing? Do journalists stay focused, or do they chase the next trending topic? These are the variables that will determine whether the Epstein case becomes a turning point or just another example of power winning. Survivors are doing their part. They're speaking out despite the trauma and risk. They're organizing despite the exhaustion. They're fighting despite decades of disappointment. The question is whether the rest of us will support them or let them down again, whether we'll demand accountability or accept convenient explanations, whether we'll stay focused or get distracted. Todd Blanche thinks this story is over. He's wrong. The Department of Justice thinks they've satisfied their obligations. They haven't. Powerful people who thought their names would stay buried in classified files are about to discover that survivors and their advocates are more determined than anticipated. 3 million pages is a lot of documents to analyze, but 1,200 survivors and thousands of supporters have plenty of time and motivation. They'll find what the Justice Department hoped would stay hidden. They'll connect the dots that officials claimed didn't exist. They'll build the case that supposedly wasn't there, and they'll demand the accountability that's been denied for far too long. That's the real story here, not the press conference, not the document dump. The real story is a community of survivors refusing to let power triumph over justice. Stay tuned to Warfield Chronicles. This investigation is just beginning.